Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take this video to talk about a movement in philosophy. We're kind of transitioning into what's referred to as the modern period. Modern philosophy really begins post 16th, 17th century. We're moving into the contemporary period of modern philosophy, starting in roughly the 19th century. And we're going to be talking about a movement that is generally referred to as existentialism. Existentialism gets its start in the mid 19th century with philosophers and novelists such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, Soren Kierkegaard, and Friedrich Nietzsche. And it kind of culminates in the mid 20th century, post World War II, with philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus, who we will be reading for this week. Now, existentialism is a very broad movement that has its roots in philosophy, but also, as you can see with Dostoevsky, its roots in literature, and quickly branches out to encompass and incorporate the other arts as well, most notably literature, but also in the mid 20th century, you'll have a very big existentialist movement in film studies, and stuff like that. So how I'm going to organize this, I'm going to talk about three major themes of existentialism. It's notoriously difficult to categorize people as existentialists. This is a historical label that we put on people. It's not something that the people themselves really claim. Famously, people like Albert Camus, who we'll be talking about a little bit today, will not consider himself to be an existentialist, but later historians would consider him to be an existentialist. So I'm going to talk about some of the general themes that can be applied to existentialist philosophy, but also existentialist literature, existentialist art, film, stuff like that. All right, so the first major theme I'm going to talk about, this is more of a historic theme. So existentialism derives its name from the root word existence, to exist. And the reason why it's labeled as such is because existentialism begins with the idea that existence, that our lived experience as humans, presents to us a philosophical problem. Now, what do I mean by problem here? So traditionally, as we've been talking about, philosophy has attempted to grapple with and explain all sorts of different phenomena. Philosophy begins in ancient Greece with an attempt to explain things like ethics, human behavior, what makes a good action, what makes a bad action. It gets its start in ancient China with the writing of Confucius, who's grappling with this question of government. Elsewhere, we have mythologies that are dealing with questions of cosmology. What is the universe? Who are we? Where did we come from? That sort of thing. Now, ancient philosophy gradually progressed into what can be loosely categorized as medieval philosophy. Medieval philosophy in the Western world has nowadays, we would look back on it and call this scholastic philosophy. Scholastic philosophy is very dense, it's very logical. The scholastics were very concerned. Most of them were Christian. Most of them were very concerned with parsing out natural law from divine law. They talk a lot about the existence of God. They talk a lot about the meaning of the religious text, but it's a very analytical, a very logical framework that's applied to religion. This gives way in modern philosophy to things that we've already talked about, such as the birth of science and the beginning of the modern political revolution. But existentialism says that the history of philosophy up until this point has been focused on the wrong thing. That the first and most immediate philosophical problem that we as humans experience is the fact that we exist, and the question of, well, what are we going to do about that? So existence as a philosophical problem is the recognition that existence is a question that needs an answer, right? Another part of this, some existentialists like to frame this as how do we live an authentic life? How do we live a life that's worth living? Now, this of course has its roots in Western philosophy and people like Socrates, who in the Apology will ask the question and make the statement, an unexamined life is not worth living. And this is the sort of quote unquote philosophy that the existentialists are interested in. What makes life worth living? What does it mean to live an authentic life? And you can see this expressed very early on by philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard. This is what Kierkegaard has to say in reference to truth. What I really need is to get clear about what I am to do, not what I must know, except insofar as knowledge must precede every act. What matters is to find my purpose, to see what it really is that God wills that I shall do. The crucial thing is to find a truth that is true for me, to find the idea for which I am willing to live and die. Of what use would it be for me for truth to stand naked before me, not caring whether or not I acknowledged it, making me uneasy rather than trustingly receptive? So Kierkegaard is reacting to traditional ideas of philosophy that sought out questions, for example, about the natural world. Kierkegaard is writing post-Enlightenment, post-scientific revolutions. So we've made all of these fantastic discoveries about the nature and origin of the universe. Newtonian mechanics has proved an invaluable tool to explain the motions of the planets. We've come to better understand our solar system. But Kierkegaard says, of what use to that is me? Of what use is that for me, I should say, right? In other words, what does it matter to me personally? Kierkegaard was one of the first philosophers to make this separation between objective and subjective truth. Objective truths are truths that we all recognize and hold and know to be true. For example, that the earth is round. Now, granted, today there are people who doubt and debate that, but let's put that aside for a moment, right? But even if we accept that the earth is round is an objective truth, that is different from subjective truth. The subjective truth would be something along the lines of, I am happy right now. Happiness is a subjective experience that really only I can know. I can tell you that I'm happy. Maybe I look happy to you. Maybe I'm acting happy, but that's really something that's only true for me. And what Kierkegaard is saying here is that we have these objective truths. That's all well and good, but there's a separation, there's a distinction here that he wants to grasp some sort of truth that is true for him. It's the subjective variety of truth, because it's the subjective truths which bring value and meaning to our lives. So this problem of existence that Kierkegaard is faced with is a problem of what those values are going to be. And this leads us to the second general theme of existentialism, and that is the issue of nihilism and the absurd. So once we recognize that existence presents to us a philosophical problem, we are immediately confronted with this question of meaning. What is the meaning of life? Friedrich Nietzsche a German philosopher, pointed out that when we ask this question, we are attempting to combat this perception of nihilism, that nihilism is the idea, belief, the philosophical position that life is devoid of meaning, that there is no meaning to life. This is best summarized in a very famous passage from a book that Nietzsche wrote called The Gay Science. And this passage is referred to as the death of God. You've probably heard a variation of this before. I'm going to read a little bit and we'll get into what this means. Sometimes it's referred to as the parable of the madman. So this is what Nietzsche says. Have you not heard of the madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I seek God, I seek God. Now there's going to be people in the marketplace, atheists, who are going to make fun of him. Has he got lost? Did he lose his way like a child? Is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a long voyage? The madman jumped in their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? He cried. I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. Nietzsche will later go on to say that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. Now, there's a couple of different ways to interpret this passage. Probably the most common interpretation that I hear is that when Nietzsche's talking about the death of God, what he's talking about is the decline of belief in God, the rise in the modern period of atheism and atheistic thinkers, right? The decline of religious belief, the decline of the status that religion once held in society. And that's partially true. Right? Nietzsche is seeing some of this happen, but mid-19th century Europe was still predominantly Christian. The church still had a very impactful role in European society. And it still does today, right? We have not witnessed the death of religion since Nietzsche's proclamation. Religion is as strong today as it has ever been. Maybe not in some of the European countries, but elsewhere around the globe, it is. Well, what is Nietzsche talking about then, if he's not talking about specifically about the death of the metaphysical deity of God? He's making a larger historical point that what specifically Western culture and civilization has not realized is that there was a base, there was a substratum of meaning that was provided by the worldview that we had adopted in Western civilization that has now been removed from under our feet. So he's not just talking about God, he's talking about the larger worldview that the medieval person inhabited. That we no longer share the same world as the medieval person. And as a result, how we understand our lives and how we understand the meaning of our lives has fundamentally and radically been changed. And Nietzsche is calling our attention to this change. How has it changed? Well, it changed in three major ways. The first is religious, right? God no longer occupies the same place in our minds that God once did. This is largely because of the advent of modern science. What was once explicable in terms of the supernatural, such as weather patterns, the motions of the planets around the sun, the place of the earth and the solar system, the status of humanity amongst the other animals, has been upturned by developments in the modern science. Copernicus, with his heliocentric universe displaced humanity from the center of the universe, from the center of the solar system. We no longer occupy a special place in the universe. We're just on one planet of hundreds of millions of planets that are floating around in space. This was further exacerbated in the mid-19th century by scientists such as Charles Darwin, who dethroned humanity from their special place in nature. We're just an animal amongst other animals. That's one element of it, yes. The other is a little bit more subtle, maybe a bit harder to realize. The second element that I would point out is the political element. If you can think back to our conversation about political philosophy, the dominant form of political system for most of human history was the monarchy. The monarchy was supported by a form of divine right. The king was made king by God. The reason that the king is king and you're not king is because the king is a special person who was chosen by God. People like philosophers like Hobbes and Locke upended that. So government is now viewed as a societal construct. Government exists because we believe that it exists, not because it has been put there by God. And the final thing is our economic status was radically altered by the development of the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization hits Europe in 1750. And for the very first time, people are confronted with the question of what they're going to do in terms of work with their lives. And this was not a question that ancient people had to ask themselves or a problem that they had to struggle with. If you were born prior to 1750, what you did with your time and what you did as a career was determined by the family that you were born into. If your parents were farmers, you were going to be a farmer. Your children were going to be farmers, and their children's children were going to be farmers. There wasn't a whole lot of choice or questioning. Nowadays, we're thrown into public education and forced to choose what we're going to do for the next 60 years of our lives by the time that we're 15 years old. I teach high schoolers. That causes a lot of anxiety for them, for good reason, right? It's kind of crazy that we have those expectations of teenagers, but we do. It can be anxiety inducing. So this is what Nietzsche is talking about when he's talking about the death of meaning. The social structures that were once in place to tell us what to do and how to do it were no longer there. So now we're confronted with this question of meaninglessness. Albert Camus, when he writes The Myth of Sisyphus, he's writing this about 70, 80 years post-Nietzsche. He'll accept most of the stuff that Nietzsche said and will argue in the face of nihilism for a position that he calls the absurdist position. The absurdist position on the one hand recognizes that there is no inherent meaning in the universe, that there is no inherent purpose in our lives, but the absurdist chooses to make meaning and purpose anyway. Camus calls this a revolt of meaning. Now, Camus is writing shortly after the Second World War, but Camus served in the Second World War for the French military, and for most of the time, he was a French freedom fighter in Nazi-occupied France. And so the analogy that Camus draws is the analogy of occupation. The Nazis were this overwhelming militaristic force that swept into France, seemingly undefeatable, but there was a small portion of the French population that still chose to put their lives on the line and to fight, to stand up against the Nazis out of principle. And Camus says that we are in the same position, only we're not standing up to Nazis, we're standing up to the absurdity of existence. in that to choose to live in the face of absurdity is an act of revolution. It's an act of revolt. This is what Camus says in The Myth of Sisyphus at the very end, right? So he talks about Sisyphus's toil, the burden that Sisyphus has to face. Sisyphus is tasked to push this boulder up a mountain for all eternity, an essentially meaningless task. And Camus says that Sisyphus is the absurd hero because Sisyphus finds meaning in this task. This is how he ends his book. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. So despite the fact that Sisyphus is doomed for all eternity to perform this meaningless task, he still finds meaning in it. So that's the problem of nihilism and the answer of absurdism. And this leads us to our last point, the last theme that's brought up by existentialist philosophers. And this is the theme of freedom and existence/essence. Now, there's a very famous line from the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre's lecture that he gave, Existentialism as a Humanism, that kind of explains this. Sartre says, what they have in common is simply the fact that they believe that existence comes before essence, or if you will, that we must begin from the subjective. Sartre's point is a point that would later come to categorize existentialism universally. The idea here is that essence is a Greek term that dates back to the philosopher Aristotle. And according to Aristotle, every person, every animal had a particular essence. That essence was an inherent purpose that their lives were meant to do, right? So the essence of ants is to build ant hills. The essence of the anteater is to eat the ant, something along those lines. And humans as well had these essences, these pre-established purposes/plans, what we call in philosophy teleology, for our lives. But Sartre says that existence precedes essence. In other words, we're born first and then have to figure out our purpose. That there is no inherent inbuilt purpose in us. It is something that we have to decide and find for ourselves after we're alive, after we're born. This is very neatly summarized in some later psychologists, most notably Viktor Frankl in his Man's Search for Meaning. This is what Frankl has to say. As each situation in life represents a challenge to man and presents a problem for him to solve, the question of meaning of life may actually be reversed. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. So Sartre says that we are free. We are completely and utterly free in determining what the meaning or what the essence of our lives are. But Sartre says that freedom is not the traditionally good thing that we think it is. Sartre says that we are condemned to be free, that freedom is a burden, that freedom is a heavy responsibility, that if given the choice, that people would voluntarily choose to not be free and choose to have their life determined for them, because figuring out and determining what our purpose is a very difficult task. All right, so those are the three, what I think are the three biggest themes of existentialism as a philosophical movement. If you have any questions, please let me know. Until next time, see you later.